Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
So, Tom, I think everybody who's been watching our podcast for a little while knows at this point I'm a pretty diehard South Park fan.
Yeah.
And for those who don't realize, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, Matt and Trey, are fairly freedom-minded guys.
Yeah.
They are equal opportunity offenders when it comes to politics on the show, but when you get them just talking about their own political beliefs, they are very much freedom people.
And they're also both Colorado natives, correct?
They are Colorado
were they
natives.
both students at CU? Am I right in that?
They were. Trey went to high school at Evergreen High School. Matt went to school, I want to say South High School in Denver or one of the DPS schools.
Yeah.
I think. I could be wrong on that one. Both met at CU Boulder.
Yeah.
And then started the show together. And they still have family here. And I've seen actually Matt around every once in a while.
You want to know how nerdy I am, Dave? I believe it was 2015. The woman I was dating, who eventually became my wife, recommended to me South Park.
Mm-hmm.
I had not heard of it. This is 2015. I mean, there were I don't know at that time 16, 17 seasons, something like that.
They're currently in season 25. so we're going back to the late 1990s.
Yeah. And I didn't know it existed as a TV series. So on her advice, I went and pulled one up. I was like, this is great stuff. And then I binged, like 17 seasons of South Park in the space of a few months.
Well, so the new season has started. I don't know if for somebody who binges, you'll probably find a time to catch up.
Yeah.
I was particularly amused at the first episode. The first episode of the new season, these guys really, as freedom guys, they thought all the mandates on masks and everything else were too far.
Right.
And beyond that, not only were the mask mandates too far, they thought that the cultural acceptance of the mandates was just insane. Right. So they decided we're taking this on full steam ahead, and they decided to make an entire show about if you don't wear pajamas every day, you can't participate in society. If you're not always wearing your pajamas, if you're not always participating. There was a great scene at Denny's. Guy wants to walk into Denny's and if he doesn't have his pajamas on, they wouldn't let him in. And he says, so they said, we just want you to be comfy wumpy. And he says, so if I'm not comfy wumpy, I can't enjoy my Rudy Tooty fresh and fruity. It was just, I was rolling on the floor laughing.
Right there. Yeah. Well, I also remember they came out with a movie a long time ago. 20 years ago, more. It was their very first movie, and the movie. It's a little raunchy. There's a whole lot from that movie we can't actually repeat on this podcast.
Yes.
But the whole theme of the movie is that the United States attacks Canada, declares war on Canada.
If anybody listened to last week's podcast, there was a Harvard professor actually advocating for that in some form or fashion.
Yeah, because of the truckers?
Because of the truckers. They weren't advocating for the attacking Canada as a country.
Right.
They wanted us to go attack the truckers, who were blocking the roadway from Canada to the United States.
And now we might have some Canadian truckers driving down into the United States and joining the convoy to Washington, D.C.
Right. And we'll see how that whole thing plays out. It goes back to this same issue of I am happy to see people who want freedom becoming more active. I'm happy to see people who advocate for freedom willing to do a little bit more to stand up and say it's time. Enough is enough.
Yep.
We didn't give you these authorities. We didn't give you these controls over us. But you have to have a stated goal and you have to have a stated mission.
Yeah.
The one ironic thing, we're talking about the start of South Park, when you're trying to be a comedian, and we've talked about this in the past. When you're trying to be a comedian, you just don't worry about who you're offending and you just try to be funny.
Right.
And they've done just a marvelous job of that.
Yep. 2 cheers for South Park. These truckers, they've been protesting, right? The whole framework, for those who haven't kept up with that story, Canada issued a rule that said you can't enter the country of Canada, can't come across the border. Canada is still old-fashioned. They actually have borders. They appear to think that those borders matter. And you can't come into Canada unless you had proof of vaccination. What that meant in practice was a whole lot of truck drivers who didn't want to get the vaccine.
Right.
They couldn't drive in the United States, pick up loads of things or drop things off and return to their home country, return home. And that was the big rub. And so they formed this convoy, headed to the Capitol to push back. And it's raised some real questions how that whole thing was handled and brought to a very swift end. Has raised the question of, what does it mean? What is the source of our freedom? What if you actually want to stand up and you're a truck driver in Canada and you want to protest your own good? Do you have the freedom to do that? According to Canadian law, according to the Canadian Constitution, you do. It says that they do. It says you have free speech and freedom of movement and you're secure in your property and all these great sounding phrases. And what we saw here in the last few days is that didn't mean very much.
Right. Well, there is a clause, and so the Canadian Constitution, I still don't totally understand. So I'm not going to pretend that I do. I don't know if you want to even go and claim.
Not much.
It's taken what you and your teachers and other scholars 240 years to understand the American Constitution to the level we do. I'm not going to dare try to understand the Canadian Constitution, but for those who don't know the whole history, there was a Bill of Rights but no Constitution in 1960 that was passed, and it sort of lined up with the UN's, what did they call it? Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes.
It lined up just after that.
Yes.
It's something that I've talked about on this podcast in the past in regard to Israel. Israel's constitution is heavily based on the UN Declaration of Rights, of Human Rights. So you had this Bill of Rights, but you had no constitution. And then in 1982, Pierre Trudeau, not Justin Trudeau, but Pierre Trudeau, came along and said, okay, we're gonna try to get a constitution passed. And in that is going to be a new charter of freedoms and natural rights, or freedoms and rights, something along those lines.
I don't think it's natural rights. It's rights.
It's just rights. And the whole idea here is this is all relatively new to them.
Right.
But Section 1 of that charter basically says that if the government deems something as detrimental to society, then all of a sudden that right doesn't apply to it.
Right.
And you have these
rights, and it sounds good. I mean, I read through it, their original Bill of Rights. I read through their Charter of Freedom. A lot of good sounding things in there. Right to free speech, right to freely move, to move around, to go where you want to go. The right of a free press, the right to you should be secure in your property and your belongings and your person. All these great sounding things. Unless the government says that there's some kind of an emergency, there's some kind of problem with your liberty, then it can squash it.
Right. If your liberty causes potential harm to what they call their democracy, right? And we just did this. Right. This was our case study, and we've been talking about this quite a bit. Yeah. If your liberty poses a potential threat to the democracy, then you lose that liberty. The government has a right to pull that liberty away, which brings us to this whole conversation of where do rights come from? And we've talked about this, but you and I were talking before we filmed and decided it was an important enough topic to revisit and to talk more about where do rights come from and
well, and it goes back, some of the wisest of the founders, and this is also a great opportunity to remind our listeners, the founders weren't all unanimous. They weren't. I think a lot of patriotic and conservative type of Americans think of the founders as this uniform group of people, right, who are all of the same mind, same opinion. They were all like a band of brothers working together. And the truth is many of them disagreed with each other, sometimes vehemently, sometimes viciously. They had big famous fights. They disagreed on all kinds of things. And one of the big disagreements was on the whole subject of a Bill of Rights.
Right.
A large number of leading founders, as well as ordinary Americans, a large number thought, yes, we absolutely need a Bill of Rights. They were very accustomed to that idea of a Bill of Rights. That was something that had emerged out of the English Civil War in the 17th century. And so that was a very popular idea among Englishmen, that a great security for their own liberty was a Bill of Rights. And you had a handful of people, most prominently Hamilton, and he persuades Madison that bills of rights are both unnecessary, you don't really need them, and more, that they're actually dangerous. Right. They can be really bad. And their argument boils down to this. You don't need a Bill of Rights because as long as a group of citizens agrees that their government is going to have only the powers that the people grant to their government. Remember, the Constitution famously begins with those three words, we the people.
Right.
And in a way, the whole idea of constitutional government is contained in those three words. We the people are creating this government. We the people are ratifying this Constitution. We the people are deciding what powers we are giving to the government. If there's ever a question, we the people are the ones who are going to decide whether we gave certain powers to our government or not. We the people can also decide to ditch a government.
Yeah.
And replace it with a new one, or replace it with adopt a new constitution if we so choose.
To the point that we've talked about, Jefferson said at some points you have a duty to do so. It's not even just a right to do so, but it's a duty to do so if it's violating your natural rights.
In the Declaration of Independence, revolution is presented as both a right and a duty. You have an obligation, a moral obligation. It's not just that you have the right or the freedom to revolt. You have an obligation to stand up and push back when some tyrannical thug is violating your rights, confiscating your property, making your life a living hell. And so this was the argument, for example, in the Federalist Papers. Bills of rights aren't necessary because take any typical freedom, free speech, for example. The way you protect free speech is you don't write down, I have the right to free speech. The way you protect free speech is never give government any power to regulate speech. Never. And then government won't regulate speech. What will the result be? Free speech. Freedom is right. People will just speak freely.
Yeah.
If you don't want government involved in religion, if you don't want them creating, official churches that you have to belong to, or regulating the exercise of religion, then don't give your government any power to regulate religion.
Right.
And the result will be religious liberty. People will create churches freely. They'll go to church or not go to church, whatever they choose to do freely. So in that sense, a Bill of Rights is unnecessary. You just don't give government power to do nefarious things, and the result will be a free people. But then Hamilton and Madison go an additional step, and they say a Bill of Rights is positively dangerous.
Yeah. Because
number one, if you list off some rights, say you list off, we have the freedom of speech, religious liberty, right to bear arms, right? We put down a handful. We say that's a pretty good list. Those in government will look at that list as exhaustive, as comprehensive. Those are the only rights you have. If there is some right, if there's some freedom that didn't make it in the list, well then apparently you don't have that right. And second of all, even worse is the rights that do get in the list, those in government, sooner or later, they're going to define what they mean. Right. And there's the whole rub. If you ask a progressive Democrat, do Americans have a constitutional right to free speech? They'll say, oh, yeah, of course. In fact, for a moment, they'll even sound like defenders of the Constitution.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, it's right there in the First Amendment. It's really important. But then, of course, they want to define what free speech means and what it doesn't mean, what the limits to free speech are. Or if you ask a progressive Democrat, do we have a constitutional right to bear arms, to own guns? Oh, absolutely. And they'll say this repeatedly, right? We're not trying to take away your constitutional right to own. We just want to define what guns are included in the right to bear arms and under what conditions you may own them and use them, right? And so on and so forth. And there's the danger. As soon as the political class starts to define the meaning of our rights, they're restricting it. They're limiting it. The realm of our freedom is getting smaller and smaller. And that was some of the founders' great insight and warning. don't adopt a Bill of Rights.
I mean, we've heard for the last several decades, more than anything, when it comes to the Second Amendment. I mean, you do have like the Dianne Feinstein moment when she was on the House floor saying, well, this is the type of gun the founders were talking about, but this isn't. And
right.
They couldn't have known that this would have existed, and they would never be okay with this. But you also have heard quite a few people say, well, sure, you have a right to bear arms if you're part of an organized militia. And a well-regulated militia. Are you part of a militia? Right. If not, you don't get to own a gun, own a weapon. And that's sort of the summary of what Madison and Hamilton were saying. I would actually, and this is a little brazen of me to suggest, but I would take their argument to another level that they didn't talk about. Several of the founders talked about how one of the necessities to maintain our republic, right? Franklin's a republic if you can keep it. Yeah. To keep our republic, you have to have a citizenry who has some civic knowledge. Yes. Right. We agree on that. That's one of our basic tenets of the Vita Veritas Society. One of our virtues. Yes. I believe that creation of the Bill of Rights has actually limited the civic knowledge of our citizens as well, has taken away the civic knowledge of our citizens.
It's diminished.
Right.
And civic knowledge.
And I don't know that Hamilton and Madison thought about that side of the danger, right? How many citizens do you hear say, government doesn't have a right to mess with my guns? We never gave them that power. Yeah. Versus, I have a Second Amendment right to carry a gun. You can't take that away from me. That latter approach is the wrong approach. Yes. And yet they don't know the difference, to the extent that one of our Harvard-educated, take that good or bad, but one of our Harvard-educated congressmen who has really come on the scene as one of the more popular members of Congress at times, and people get frustrated with him at times, Dan Crenshaw, recently just tweeted a whole thing about how what's happening in Australia and Canada and some of these other countries around the world is exactly why you need a Bill of Rights. Right. And he made it very clear. He said, for anybody who's ever said that the American Bill of Rights was silly and unnecessary, take a look at what's happening in Canada and Australia right now.
It would be interesting to know if he knows that Canada has a Bill of Rights. It has a Bill of Rights. It has a Charter of Freedoms. I mean, they have what Congressman Crenshaw is suggesting. It also points to the whole problem. I think you make a great point that a Bill of Rights diminishes the civic understanding of citizens about the constitutional powers of their own government, because instead they focus on their rights that are in their Bill of Rights. Well, I have a right to free speech, and I have a right to a gun, and I have a right to religious liberty, and these things. This was Hamilton's whole emphasis. And it's interesting because Hamilton sometimes gets the rap, has the reputation as one of the first movers for big government, one of the first proponents. And yet there's Hamilton as a young mind warning Americans, saying this is a strategic mistake. If you focus on your rights, your whole emphasis, we don't want a politics of rights, people clamoring for their rights and then fighting over what a right means or doesn't mean. Rather, we want our politics to revolve around questions of government power. Anytime government does anything, the question Hamilton wanted raised was, did we actually grant that power to government or not? Which is a whole different, right? Think of that scene of Dianne Feinstein, United States Senator, sitting there looking at different guns and trying to decide which ones she finds to be scary. Sure. And should be prohibited, and which ones are not scary, at least to her, and are therefore protected within the Second Amendment. It changes that entire conversation if we say, hey, let's just ignore the whole idea of a right to bear arms. Senator, what constitutional power do you have to regulate the weapons of citizens? Mm-hmm. And the answer is none. Right. The Constitution doesn't grant to Congress any power over that subject. And so her opinions, her feelings about different kinds of guns, right, become really irrelevant. It's a real game changer. And if we were to have that kind of politics, that would encourage a deep, over time, when people are routinely talking about the constitutional powers we, the people, have granted to government, I think it would incentivize a deeper constitutional knowledge among citizens. because they would be used to having those conversations.
Yes.
We don't have those conversations. Instead, we clamor about our rights, right? Some of which are in the Bill of Rights. Others are just made up. People talk about they have a right to health care and they have a right to affordable housing, right? They have all these, which really is just to say their wants and needs, things that they want and need. They declare that they have a right to it. I saw the Supreme Court has just granted certiorari in a case out of Colorado, and it's back to this whole little businesses that don't want to offer some kind of service for a same-sex wedding. In this case, I think it's not a cake baker. It's it's someone who makes websites or offers some kind of web services. And this business owner doesn't want to host web services for same-sex weddings. I was just reading in the New York Times the way this is presented, and this is the way it will be talked about by both liberals and conservatives. Is how do you reconcile the application of public accommodation laws, that is government commanding business owners, you must interact with and do business with people that you don't want to. How do you reconcile that with religious liberty? Because this business owner is again saying, I have these religious beliefs. And the answer is, the way you reconcile it is you get rid of the public accommodation laws.
By saying
you get rid of it.
By saying that we never gave the government the right to create public accommodation laws. And if Congress does want to create public accommodation laws, make a constitutional amendment.
That's right.
And try to get it passed.
That's right. You know, and this fight, I mean, of the 50 states, or 57 if you're Barack Obama, 46 of our states have state-based public accommodation laws, which effectively say if you run a certain kind of business, then you shall not discriminate based on, and there's usually a race, sex, religious affiliation, things like that. And then of course the granddaddy of them all is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title II. And this got Barry Goldwater in hot water when he was running for president of the United States, because he was quite open he rejected the 64 Civil Rights Act on this basis. He said, look, we in Congress have no constitutional power to pass a law that tells business owners, citizens, with whom they must trade or exchange. We might think it's rude of someone to say no, but we don't actually have that. We don't have that power. He was thinking like a constitutionalist, right?
Sure.
And instead, what this is all going to boil down to is a kind of rights-based. One party is going to say, well, I have a right to religious liberty, which is why I don't have to interact with someone if I don't want to interact. And then the others are going to say, I have a right to services from this business, and I have a right to not be discriminated against. And I guarantee already that the answer will be, the opinion of the court's going to be convoluted and focused on all the wrong things. What it should be focused on is this whole question: did we, the people, grant to our government, whether it's our state government, it's the federal government, we should always be asking, did we actually give them power to do the thing that government did? If Canadians were asking that question, it would be, did we, the people of Canada, actually give to our government power to come arrest and beat up and smash windows of truck drivers who are protesting unconstitutional mandates and orders?
Well, but that goes back to what that country, and there's so many directions we can take this conversation, but that goes back to what that country in particular, where they all agree their rights come from.
Yes.
Do their rights come to them naturally, or is the government giving them rights? Do they not have rights until the government gives them to them? And in the United States, we were founded on the idea that we have our natural rights, and our government's sole job is to protect those natural rights. Ronald Reagan, you pointed this out to me recently, that Ronald Reagan made an observation at one point during his political career about looking at constitutions from all these other countries, whether it's America or Canada, or Russia or any of these Soviet countries.
He gave a speech in which he specifically said he had been reading the Soviet Constitution. There was a Soviet Constitution, and he was reading an English translation of it. And he said, there are parts of that Soviet Constitution that sound just like ours. Things like the right to free speech and the right to religious liberty. It's all in their Constitution, Reagan observed, he said, then he realizes the difference. And at first it seems so subtle, you almost miss it. And yet it's everything. And the difference is the Soviet Constitution says we in the government grant to the people certain rights and freedoms, which means they get to define them, control them, take them back if they want to, rescind them, versus the United States Constitution says we, the people, grant the following powers, right, to government. It's a game changer. In a way, I mean, I've been at this a long time, and so this might sound a little strange to some of our audience members. It might even sound a little unpatriotic in a way, but I've become kind of a critic of rights-based politics. I don't like talking about our rights in any context. I like a constitutional power-based politics. That is a politics that all revolves around discussions of what did we actually authorize our government to do and the many things we did not authorize our government to do.
Well, but the problem or the responsibility is the better word. The responsibility that creates is to the citizenry to educate their neighbors, to say, don't go give government the right to this. Don't.
Well, before they even educate their neighbors, they got to educate themselves, right? The individual has to understand some of these things so that they can teach it to neighbors and their children and people around them.
And that goes back to the idea of civic knowledge. That goes back to the responsibility that the founders put on us as citizens, that you can't go out and share these ideas until you actually understand them yourself.
But, think about, and I want our listeners here to think about this. By the way, you've mentioned a couple times, our core virtues, and it's probably a good opportunity to remind our listeners within the Academy section of VinoVeritasSociety.com, we have seminars in there, and we have a seminar on citizenship, the basics of citizenship, and included in that seminar are these quite beautiful little flashcards that include our precepts and our virtues. They're just good reminders, and people are free to use those however they want to. It's in the seminar on citizenship. This bigger point that you're making is it's so important to get people to think through what they've actually delegated to their government. It's such a different way of thinking about things than thinking about them in a kind of rights base. When you listen to us talk about these matters, think of how different it is than listening to lawyers. If you listen to lawyers, right, talk about rights, and they will. Lawyers will talk about rights. They'll talk about freedoms. They'll talk about liberties. But they always talk about them in a very legalistic way. Under this law, under the Bill of Rights, right, and the government has defined free speech to mean this, or the government has defined property rights to include this, but not these other things. That's exactly what Hamilton and Madison wanted to avoid. Didn't want our freedoms and our liberties, our rights to be thought of in legalistic terms, what has been legally defined. They thought our most important rights are natural rights.
Right.
They're natural. They don't come from a law. They don't come from a regulation. That idea, and we talk about it, we repeat it often. I think it's really hard for many Americans to fully get their minds around that concept, that we have rights by virtue of being a human being. There is not even the Declaration of Independence. We could tear up the Declaration. We could burn it, throw it away. It could be gone forever and eliminate all copies of the Declaration.
Right. Not that we're advocating for that, because it is one of the most beautiful things ever written.
But the point is, right, you and I and every other human being on earth would still have a natural right to our own liberty, our own life, our own free pursuit of happiness, our own private we would still have a rightful claim by nature to these things. That's what that concept of natural rights means.
You talk about how lawyers talk about this, and I am not a Supreme Court scholar. We have others within the organization who are really good at that.
Yeah.
You probably know a little bit more about this than I do, but I do know, you go back to the most famous gun rights case the Supreme Court has ever heard, the Heller decision.
Yeah.
Heller was about defining what the Second Amendment meant. I mean, the majority of that Heller conversation was not the government doesn't have a right to control weapons unless they pass a constitutional amendment. The Heller decision was a conversation about what does the Second Amendment mean and how are we supposed to interpret it? And the minute that happened, the entire gun community has taken that path of we must defend the Second Amendment because of Heller and because of the Second Amendment protections. The founders wrote in that the government, you can't violate that, and therefore we know we now have that right because the founders gave us that right. No, they didn't. The founders didn't give us the right to keep and bear arms. We had that right naturally.
Here's the other great danger. This is sort of intrinsic in what we're talking about, but it's worth, or it's implied, it's worth mentioning it. There's a concept. It's a political concept. It's also a concept in law of plenary power. Mm-hmm. Plenary power means original total power. In many medieval kingdoms, the king was said to have plenary power. Yeah. Total, unlimited, original power. And he could do with that power anything. He could delegate it to others if he wanted to. He could issue edicts and enforce them. I mean, he had total plenary power. A Bill of Rights implies that government has plenary power over many things, because the whole concept of the Bill of Rights is, well, apparently government may do anything that it wants to do. It has plenary power, total, original, unlimited power over everything, except for the few provisions that make it into the Bill of Rights. When we think about guns, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, let's say there are certain weapons that are not protected by the Bill of Rights or by the Second Amendment. In fact, let's kind of make this clear. A tank, a Sherman tank. Yeah. Let's assume, for the sake of argument here, you and I and our listeners, let's just assume that a Sherman tank is not protected by the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms, as defined in the Second Amendment, does not include the right to own a tank.
You're hitting me in the heart here. I really one day want somebody to open my garage and just see a barrel of a tank pointing right at them.
So what's the assumption? What is being implied there? What's being implied is, well, if it's not protected by the Second Amendment, then clearly government can regulate it.
Right.
No, we have a Constitution that lists powers, and there's no power to control or regulate or define what our weapons are. Now, some listeners right now are saying, oh, good grief, is Krannawitter suggesting that a citizen could own or buy or build a tank? Yes, absolutely. Certainly, any weapons that our government buys and builds and owns, then citizens should be free to buy and build and own. And that will strike many people as a little loony. It will strike people as scary, right? But that's what freedom ultimately means. Freedom means being wise enough and courageous enough and insightful enough to know that very likely the greatest threat to us will be our own government. Because in the history of mankind, that has proven to be the case over and over and over, that the greatest threat to people often is their own government. And so whatever the government is going to have, whatever means of force and violence the government is going to use, then citizens should have that too. Because what is to happen if the government turns on the people? And that idea that no, we have not given our government any power to regulate our weapons. Weapons. I'm not just talking guns. I'm talking weapons of any kind. We didn't give them that power. That gets lost when the whole focus is, well, let's see, we have a right to bear arms. So what does it mean to bear? Does that mean to own? Does that mean literally to hold? If we're in a militia, what are arms? Does it mean only black powder, guns like they had at that time, or does it include a semi-automatic pistol or an AR-15? That whole realm of discussion of what the Second Amendment means ignores the far more important fact, which is we, the people, gave no power at all to Congress or to any part of the federal government to regulate our weapons.
And what it does is it also allows the government to turn huge numbers of citizens into criminals that aren't doing anything wrong.
You're right.
Right? I mean, and we talk about this whole idea of criminal reform and justice reform and all of the things. this is just one more example of how government has come along, created arbitrary laws that they were never given the power to have. And when they did that, they did it with arguably good intentions.
Yeah.
But those good intentions have been failures in practice. And all they have managed to do is criminalize huge swaths of citizens. And there are, I mean, we hear this all the time now. We hear this new term because they think it sounds scary. Ghost guns. Right? A ghost gun is no different than a gun you buy in the store. It just happens to be something that was assembled from various parts, and some were 3D printed and other things like that all of a sudden you can have an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle that is not traceable, that the government isn't aware exists. So the government has decided that's a ghost gun, and we're going to call it a ghost gun because that sounds scary, and therefore people should be afraid of them.
And that whole problem that you're describing is really turned into this great dramatic feature-length movie. Think of some of the science fiction. In particular, what I have in my mind is Iron Man.
Right.
What if, rather than a ghost gun, someone makes the Iron Man suit?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's sort of the premise of the whole Marvel comic series, right? This great mind, this inventor, Tony Stark, he invents something that it can be a weapon. It's not merely a weapon. It certainly can be used as a weapon. He's not buying it from anybody. He designs it and makes it. And it's a suit that allows him to fly around and, shoot cool things out of his hands and all that. What constitutional power does the federal government have to come along and say, what, you can't make that, or we're going to take that away from you, or you have to register it? You got to put a serial number on it, and and the answer is none. They have no constitutional power over that.
Take that example. Let's take that a few more steps, because that whole story is a perfect example of this. Let's remember what Tony Stark did before creating the Iron Man suit. He was a weapons manufacturer for the United States government. Right. So it was okay. If he had built it for them,
then it's okay.
Yes. But the minute he built it for himself, this is the same guy. He could build one for both of them. In fact, he does in later episodes of the movie or versions of the movies. As long as he's building it for the government, it's okay. But when he builds it for himself, that's a problem.
Yeah.
The second part of this is, if you remember the first quarter of that movie after he builds it, the Air Force is going after him.
Right.
There is the United States Air Force is saying there is an unidentified object out there that must be a threat. We don't know what it is, so we're going to assume it's a threat, and we're going after it with the full force, and they try to shoot him down.
Yes.
This guy just flying through the air, not bothering anybody, and they're trying to shoot him down.
There's a great scene, and I mean, I want to emphasize here, this isn't just Dave and Tom talking about fun movies they like. There are principles involved here, really important.
Yeah.
This is where the realm of fiction, including science fiction and other forms of fiction, can be really useful, because it helps to dramatize and highlight and illustrate key aspects of human life and key principles. There's a wonderful scene, I think it's in the very first Iron Man movie, where he's in a hearing. Tony Stark there's a committee in the United States Senate, right? And he gets into a spat with one of the senators. And at some point he says, look, that's my suit. I made it. You can't have it.
Yeah.
That's my property, period. And he gets up and walks out. He's right about that. That is his suit. He actually made it. That's his property. And so all of this, some of our listeners are sitting here thinking right now, so what are you guys saying? That we should abolish the Bill of Rights? No, that's not realistic. It'd probably be a good thing if we could, but it's not very likely to happen. I'm not here encouraging that we go launch a campaign to repeal the Bill of Rights. What I am encouraging is that citizens shift their attention, start paying less attention to the Bill of Rights, start paying less attention to the very concept of rights, and focus more on what powers did we actually grant government. We've been talking today about powers we the people never granted government, and yet government goes and regulates and controls all sorts of things. Then there's the related problem of powers we actually do grant government. Yeah. And sometimes we're foolish. We grant government powers that we shouldn't. The Canadian trucker protest, that's a result of 2 years of lockdowns and mandates and shelter-in-place orders, right? And all these things in the name of COVID. By the way, in the name of a virus, which I'm still convinced when all the dust has settled, it's going to be very clear that our government and other governments work to create this thing in a laboratory.
Yes.
So they create a virus and then turn around and say, oh, whoops, it got out. Now we in the government are going to ruin your lives and shut down your businesses and cause havoc because of this virus that we created. But it raises an interesting question. Think of all the things governments have been doing here in the United States and around the world, making people stay home, making businesses close. And it has destroyed lives, terrible things. Rates of suicide and depression and mental illnesses are off the charts right now. But also from a financial point of view, many people have lost everything. Right here where we live, all kinds of old, famous, wonderful restaurants and other establishments gone. They're just closed up, boarded up. And that's the story across the country. How have those in government been able to enforce all these executive orders and emergency policies and regulations? Because those in government are relatively few. There's a whole lot more of us who are not in government than are in government. And the answer is at the state, county, and local level, licensures.
Yeah.
Licenses that, and what I mean by that, I mean those licenses that you need to conduct business as a professional. You want to run a liquor store? What's the first thing you need? A liquor license, right? You want to run a restaurant, you want to run a hotel, you want to open a massage parlor, you want to open a beauty salon and cut people's hair. All those things. What's the first thing you need? A license from the government. Sometimes they're expensive. They're many hundreds or even thousands of dollars.
And take years to get.
Yes.
Right? It's not like you can just go apply. It sometimes takes years to get, and you have to have a certain amount of education and schooling and all of these types of things. And I'm glad you brought up beauty parlors at the end. I was just recently reading the story of the owner of that salon in San Francisco where Nancy Pelosi early on in the pandemic, where she
told everyone else to stay home, and she went and got a haircut
without a mask on and without anything else.
Right.
And the video got leaked.
Right.
That woman got harassed. Her license got pulled. They started harassing her at home. They started raising her property tax. I mean, they went after her to the point where she closed the salon. She sold the building. She left her house. She packed up and she moved to Texas. And she had to leave her entire her entire social life and her life that was in San Francisco because Nancy Pelosi, who has all of this power, decided, I'm going to ruin you.
Yeah.
You got me caught and I'm going to ruin your life. My son is your governor, or my nephew rather, is your governor. We're going to ruin your life. You are done. You are never going to exist in this town again. And it got to the point where I was reading this woman's comments. She's now in Texas. She's been a salon owner her entire professional career. She's trying to find something else to do. Why? Because she wants to find something that doesn't require a license. She says, I'm not going to put that out there again.
I didn't know this story. I'm glad you brought this up because there's the pivotal point. There's the hinge right there. We have been sold this bill of goods. We were talking about bills of rights earlier. This is a bill of goods. This is nonsense.
Yeah.
That without licenses somehow are a guarantee of excellence. If you don't have licensed beauticians, well, then they'll be killing people. Right? Or at a minimum, they'll ruin your hair.
Your hair's going to fall out.
And even worse, they might actually harm you.
Yeah.
All of which is nonsense. The truth is the pressure of a marketplace is relentless and intense. I would dare anybody, go try to run a beauty salon and hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
And you see how long you're in business.
Right.
The answer is you won't be in business very long because people will real quickly figure out that beautician doesn't know what she's doing. She actually hurts people and no one will come. And it doesn't matter if that beautician has a license or not. We also know that people with licenses, all kinds of licensed professionals, do terrible, horrible things. I was just reminded, a good friend of ours, one of our members, wrote on my Facebook page the other day how not too long ago, he got food poisoning from a restaurant that complies with all the requirements of the health department to get the license from the health department, right, to run it. And he still got food poisoning. And so I've been saying this for 20 years. Licenses do not guarantee excellence.
No.
What they do is they're a form of control and power so that those in government can control people through their licenses. And I hope growing numbers of people learn the lesson that woman that you described going from California, she learned this lesson. As long as I have a license, then government can command me to do anything. And if I disagree, if I fail to comply, what will they do? They'll take my license away. And the minute they take my license away, you become a criminal. If you try to keep offering the professional services that you offer or running your business, you become you open yourself up to life-ending civil litigation, criminal litigation. You can't do it. Another friend of ours, in the early stages of COVID lockdowns, she used to run a wonderful little winery and restaurant, and she pushed back. She tried to stay open. She wanted to stay open, and it really came down to they could take her license away, which would make her a criminal. And so, one of the challenges we've put out there this is especially true at the state level, because most licenses in most industries and businesses are issued at the state level from the state government. Yep. And so a challenge I've put out is I challenge any state legislature, repeal a license. Pick one of the more ridiculous ones, like licenses to walk dogs. I mean, come on. How, in Miami, what's the county where Florida?
Miami-Dade.
Dade County. Yeah. Dade County. You have to have a license to be a stripper.
Right.
Really? That's number one. That's just extortion. That's just a shakedown for money, right? It's
Which
a way to
is
get
all
money.
licenses are.
And then number two, they can, if you fail to comply with something, they'll take your license away, and you can't go strip anymore. I mean, come on, get rid of some of these licenses because they're just power grabs.
I want to know who was the government official at the time in Miami who said, I'm going to create this, because what this guy was thinking. He's sitting there thinking, I get to sit there and I'm going to sit and get to watch every stripper and decide if she gets a license or not. And that was the only reason he created it, right? He's like, I get to create revenue for my department. I get to create a bureaucratic seat that we know can't be taken away.
And I get to meet all the strippers.
And I get to meet every stripper in town. And I lived in Miami. There are some dirty men in Miami who that's all they wanted to get out of this. You brought up our friend at the winery. Yeah. And similar to the woman in San Francisco, what government does is break people's spirit. Mm-hmm. She could have sold. She probably could have even moved. Hers wasn't just a state problem. Hers was a county problem. Yes. She was dealing with a county government that was out to destroy her.
Yeah. Well, actually, in fact, here in Colorado, and this certainly exists in other states as well, you have these health departments that aren't really, they're not creatures of the state, but they're also not creatures of a particular county. Multiple counties will come together. Here, for example, we have a tri-county health department, and it turns out their powers are tyrannical. In a case of a declared public health emergency, there's virtually no limit to their power at all.
And she could have very easily picked up, taken all of her equipment, taken all of her stuff, and said, I'm going to another county. And she had fans all over the state. And she has since moved. And she could have gone to where she's living now and probably had an easier time with that county. Yeah. The government broke her spirit. And think about what that means from an economic standpoint. And think about what that means from the government isn't here. These licensures aren't here to make sure that we have productive citizens. They're here to make sure we have dependent citizens. Bureaucrats want to make sure we have dependent citizens. And when we talk about the economic impact of government, as we talk about these truckers who are now starting their path from Southern California to Washington, D.C., their path is from San Diego to Washington, D.C. They're planning on arriving in Washington, D.C. on March 1st, which is the day of the State of the Union address. Okay. And the one thing that they are protesting, and like we've said, we have questions about what are their goals, what are they trying to accomplish. I hope the one thing they do is they do bring attention to the one other thing that government has decided they can do that we never gave government the power to do in the Constitution, and that's own land. And government has decided that if they own land, they get to make all the rules on that land. Right. So what we're seeing in San Francisco or in San Diego right now, the reason these truckers are so upset is Gavin Newsom has decided that all truckers should be part of the truckers union. They should all work for the big trucking companies.
Right.
When in reality, just like Canada, most truckers, and I'm talking a vast majority, I don't know, 70, 80% are individual truckers. They own their truck. They live in their truck. Some of them have a small home, but they live in their truck. They sleep in the cab, and that's all they do. And there are brokerages that send out, here's your shipment. Do somebody want to take this for me? What has happened is Gavin Newsom has said, you can't go to the port because the port is owned by the state.
Yep.
So the port in San Diego is owned by the state, and if you're not vaccinated and you're not wearing a mask, you can't enter government property.
Yeah.
And you can't drive through government property. What about some of the state parks? What about he's restricting their ability to do their job. Now, we can feel bad for the truckers, and I do. I am terribly upset about what has happened to these truckers and their ability to make a living. But I hope everybody realizes what it's doing to us as well. And what it's doing to us is that's causing the supply chain shortages. That's causing some of our, outside of gas, which is a whole other conversation, but we are seeing all of our groceries get more expensive. All of our bills get more expensive. Yeah. We're seeing empty shelves. We've talked in the past about this ongoing Twitter trending hashtag of bare shelves Biden. That's all happening because Gavin Newsom isn't letting our truckers go onto the ports to carry anything off.
And so cargo ships can't unload because there are no trucks there, to put the stuff on. And so you have cargo ships sitting out in the Pacific Ocean, just floating around, waiting to come in and hopefully have someone to unload them.
And where else do we get our goods from? We get them from Canada.
Yeah.
So if truckers can't come down from Canada and truckers can't unload ships in San Diego, what happens? We have a shortage of goods basic supply and demand, and all of a sudden everything gets really expensive.
Well, so back to this bigger point I was making of, we talked earlier in the show about powers we the people never did give to our government. And now we've been talking about powers we did give, and it's kind of foolish. At the state level, it turns out in many of our state constitutions, the people of various states, I tend to be kind of a critic of state constitutions. I think many of them are poorly designed because they are written as if their state government has something like plenary power over most areas of life. And then those state legislatures are pretty free to write basically any kind of law that they want to, including many states have passed laws that grant almost unlimited discretionary powers to the executive, to the governor, in times of declared emergencies. And so we've seen all kinds of abuses. That's the kind of power that Gavin Newsom is exercising.
Right.
They have a declared pandemic emergency that grants to him almost all power to make these kinds of regulations and policies. Many states have granted to their state government the power to issue licenses, professional licensing. And so they've acted on that. And I'm suggesting that people sit back and think about, number one, what powers did we never give to government? And then number two, what powers did we give and do so foolishly? Maybe it's time to pull some of those powers back. It could come in the form of constitution revisions in various states, maybe adopting a new constitution or amending a constitution. It can also be in the form of repealing some legislation. For example, many of the state licenses could be abolished with an act of a state legislature. So there's a number of practical things to do, but the focus right now should not be on what new program are we going to create or what new policy. It should be on rescinding, retracting, scaling in, repealing, abolishing, eliminating some of the things that we have right now.
And you're right, and I appreciate you clarifying that. When I said we did not give government the power to own land, I was talking about initially in the Constitution, we don't give the federal government power to own land. Now that came along later, but we never actually said in a constitutional amendment the government can go out and create national parks and all of those types of things. But that kind of trickled down to the states and everything else. So there are states, obviously, that did say in their constitution, you get the right to own the state can own property and the state can do ports
and things like that,
and
yes.
maintain and manage them. Airports, it's where we get TSA and all the rules about flying and everything else. And
think of like in the state of New York, how powerful the Port Authority is, right? I mean, that is a mighty powerful, can regulate what goes on within those ports, who's allowed, who's not allowed. It's enormous. And so I think that's one of the most important things, rather than chasing after the news of the day, which many Americans do that. They occupy, right? Whatever the next outrageous thing is that, I don't know, Whoopi Goldberg says, or, any
Joy
other
Behar.
celebrity or athlete or anybody like that. What's far more important is to realize all the things that our governments at different levels are doing. And how do we bring some of it to an end? How do we retract? How do we rescind some of that power?
I hate to take this to a lighter note as we finish up, because that's a really important point.
Yeah.
But there is some irony in this whole conversation. Irony is an interesting word. We talked about Iron Man, right? And the Marvel franchise.
Yeah.
Latest victim of cancel culture is Evangeline Lilly. Evangeline Lilly is in the Ant-Man franchise. Most people remember her as one of the main characters on the show Lost. And Evangeline Lilly is Canadian. And Evangeline Lilly came out last week and said, I just wish Justin Trudeau would talk to the truckers. She didn't give an opinion. She didn't say, here's what I want. She says, this isn't Canadian. This isn't the way we do things in Canada.
Off with her head.
And demands they want her off of Marvel. They want her to have nothing to do with Marvel ever again. Because she just merely suggested that the thing we do in Canada is we talk. We're civil. We respect each other. And Justin Trudeau should talk to the truckers.
Yeah.
And now she's being canceled.
Off with her head, Dave.
So you talked about Iron Man and you talked about Marvel and all of these things.
Yeah.
It's sort of this interesting full circle. So while we can't control what they do up in Canada, borders matter from that perspective, and that's a whole other conversation.
I know there are a lot of Ukrainians right now who think borders matter and they care.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have to talk about that another time.
I think this is one of those things that I hope it got people thinking, and I hope people start to think more about how do we defend the American idea? How do we guard the American idea? And it starts with civic knowledge. It starts with understanding the design of the American government and the design of the Constitution better, and being able to talk about it.
Yep. Till next time.
Nos sumus custodes.
There you go.